Welcome to Against the Current, a podcast created to give public and private sector leaders, both current and emerging, as well as advocates and cultural voices, a platform to share their perspectives with candor and conviction. Each episode goes beyond talking points to uncover the real stories, challenges, and lessons shaping today's most important causes. These conversations connect directly to decision makers, donors, and supporters who want to understand not just what an organization does, but why it matters. You'll hear how faith guides leadership, how conviction drives action, and how bold ideas are shaping the future of freedom and culture, both here at home and around the world. Here is your host, Matt Waters.
Welcome to Against the Current, fearless conversation. And today's guest is Mark Tooley. He is the president of the Institute for Religion and Democracy. Mark is a fighter on a number of things. He's fighting in the church world for Methodism, for holiness. You've got a lot of work, Mark, you do on defense policy in the United States of America. You're a CIA guy. I don't know much you could tell us about that. Be interested to know how you went from that to kind of this fighting, this rigorous fight you have for the Methodist faith, and fighting for all things that are good, true, and beautiful. So, Mark Tooley, thanks for coming on and joining us. And I'll let you, the many things I've missed. And by the way, I'll just say that you wrote a great book called The Peace, if I remember correctly, right? That almost saved the war, saved us from going into the Civil War. And that was a few years ago. So you're an author as well. You're a columnist. So Mark, I'll turn it over to you to sort of introduce yourself to our guests who may not know you.
Thank you, Matt. A pleasure to talk with you. As noted, I'm president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy in Washington, D.C., founded in 1981 by Christian thinkers as an ecumenical Christian think tank, making the case for democracy, human rights, and religious freedom for all people, and stressing that churches are vital for a healthy democracy, a healthy society, and churches, to be healthy, need to uphold their own beliefs and remain vigorously orthodox. So the world and American Christianity have changed a great deal since 1981, but the need to make the case for democracy, human rights, religious freedom, and Christian vitality in our churches remains, and we have to operate through a different prism, I suppose. Much of IRD's history was focused on the mainline Protestant denominations and helping those who were or are Orthodox in those denominations struggle on behalf of orthodoxy. Those battles are now concluded, and more importantly, we're in a new post-denominational age in America, in that very rarely do people under the age of 60 even care about denominations, even if they're a member of a denomination. So we have to speak to that reality.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Well, I think you're right on. I mean, I think that's where, I'll just, personal story. Of course, you by the way know my son Jack Waters,
Yes.
and he's at an Anglican seminary. And then this past weekend we were at the church we're attending, which is it's a community chapel, and it's non-denom. And as a guy who went to Reformed Theological Seminary, a PCA person, I find myself in a broadly Reformed church, partly because my daughters go there. But so there's very different reasons why people make these decisions. But to your point, I mean, it's casual. No one's wearing a shirt and a tie. It's just a whole different vibe right now. Music, it's not the hymn book. It's all on video screen. You don't know the hymns unless you're like my daughters can sing along with every hymn. They're 16 and 13, or every song. And I'm like, what are these songs? Well, they sing them at, Young Life at the summer camp. So for old guys like me, I'm like, well, okay, I've got to kind of get with the program here. So yeah, I mean, you talk about your work in the mainline denomination. What happened? I think I have an idea, but tell us what happened to the main lines. What's going on?
That was a 100-year story. It began in the 1890s or early 20th century when the mainline Protestant seminaries went liberal or modernist, rejecting this supernatural aspects of the gospel and the need for personal conversion. That didn't necessarily lead to different attitudes at the local church level. It was confined to a certain number of educated clergy, but it obviously had a huge impact across the decades. And it manifested itself in a struggle or a battle over sexuality and the definition of marriage starting in the 1970s in all the mainline churches. And the Orthodox side, even though the denominations, leadership, and seminaries and upper reaches of authority were thoroughly theologically liberal, the laity and more traditional clergy won the battles on sexuality through the 70s and the 80s and the 90s until with the exception arguably of the United Church of Christ. But then in 2003, the Episcopal Church elected its first openly practicing gay bishop. And from there on, the Orthodox side won or lost. And all the mainline churches, except for the largest one, the United Methodist Church, of which I'm a member. And that was only because its membership was international and the growing part of the church was in Africa. And so the African delegates at the governing general conference voted with the Orthodox until finally 2019, the traditional side was reaffirmed by the United Methodist Church, but by a vote of 53 to 47%, along with a new church law lasting 4 years, allowing congregations to leave the denomination with their church property. And so the conservative or traditional side decided over the next several years to leave the United Methodist Church during that window of opportunity, so that nearly 8,000 congregations left United Methodism until that window closed in 2023, half of whom joined a new global Methodist church. And so we have the new denominations, as you know, the Anglican Church in North America, a new Lutheran church, a new Presbyterian church, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and so this slide into non-denominationalism, I think there's two things happening, right? There's less a church attendance overall. I think I'm going to guess from my read, a lot of that's COVID. Churches flat out shut down. A lot of people didn't go back. But there's also a counter narrative, Mark, of young people, in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk being murdered, of people returning to the church. Is that your sense?
Yes, for remarkably across 85, 90 years, church attendance in America, at least according to the Gallup poll, stayed about the same, fluctuating a little more than 40%, a little under 40% from the 1930s up until COVID. And COVID really devastated church attendance. So it's maybe at 30% now, but it's harder to measure because you count the people watching online. And of course, with the retreat of denominations, more people attending churches, it's hard to measure where these non-denominational churches are. They don't keep statistics like the old style denominations did. So it's a much more complex reality. And is there an uptick in church attendance now? Maybe. Much of the evidence seems anecdotal. There are some surveys indicating maybe it's the case, but I think we really need at least a couple of years before we can look back and say that the decline in church participation has been reversed. But as you know, for a number of years, there have been smart, educated young people who have been more drawn to traditional aspects of Christianity, including Anglicanism, such as your son. And so that's a small number of people, but it's a significant number. The people who are doing it are significant in that they're going to be leaders and shapers of culture.
Yeah, and to that point, you see, in the Anglican Church, there is growth, right? There is some moderate growth in the Anglican Church, right? Which is a kind of a anomaly when you look at denominations. I think the PCA has small growth. I looked at this a while ago, and in Washington, a lot of the folks that are policymakers in positions of power, they happen to be Catholic, especially on the conservative side, right? There's a lot of right wingers who are Catholic. We'll talk about one notable one here in a few minutes that you've taken exception with, Nit Fuentes. But but a lot of them are Catholic, and I think it's interesting that the number of people, you hear about these big moves to the church, like the big, yesterday's Washington Post was Charles Murray's op-ed about his coming to faith. He didn't really talk about how, where he landed or what's going on. I haven't read his book yet. I plan to. I love Charles Murray. I've always liked his work, and I'm excited to see him come into the faith. Um, but these while you hear about these big names sometimes going Catholic, on the underbelly of the Catholic Church, there's a lot of people leaving as well. So I mean, I saw the number. It's like for every one that comes in, 5 or 6 walk out the door. And so I don't know if you guys look at that. Do you guys look at the, kind of the Orthodox Catholics as well, Greek Orthodox, or are you just focused on the Protestants?
We're ecumenical, so we're interested in all of the above. But yes, there's often a popular impression that a lot of Protestants are becoming Catholics, especially in DC. But the statistics show that it's the opposite. But very often, the Protestant converts to Catholicism are high profile, prominent people, public thinkers, intellectuals. And so they make a splash when it happens.
Right. Yeah, I find that interesting, and the growth. So you wouldn't put the Catholic Church in the main lines, would you? You wouldn't call that a mainline denomination. We've never talked about it that way. Where do they fit?
Mainline Protestant is a very specific term that applies to 7 current denominations: United Methodist, Episcopal, Presbyterian, USA, Evangelical Lutheran, Disciples of Christ, United Church of Christ, American Baptist. These are the historic denominations that, as I mentioned, theologically liberalized early in the 20th century. So the Southern Baptists are not a mainline Protestant denomination because they have a different history. And obviously, the Catholics are not Protestants, so they stand on their own, and the same for the Eastern Orthodox. Sometimes people confuse the term mainline with mainstream, but two different definitions.
Let me ask you maybe a different way. Do the Catholics have a mainline problem? I mean, is there a you see people leaving the mainline denominations. This is what you've done. Are people leaving the Catholic Church in a similar way? Any idea on that?
Their percentage, I don't think the Catholic Church in America is losing numerically, but it is declining as a percentage of the population as more and more Americans religiously unaffiliate, which doesn't mean they're not religious. It doesn't even mean they're not going to church. But according to most surveys, maybe 37% of Americans do not affiliate or associate with any formal religious tradition.
Yeah, interesting. Well, that portends a future of America that's very different than our founding, right? This is the rub with Christians like us. It's like, well, what does that actually mean, right? Where does this actually go? Mark Tooley, over to you. What does this mean? Tell us where do we go from here? If that number keeps shrinking of people that go to church, that's good. That's an impact, right?
Well, it obviously makes society overall more secular, but it also changes the face of Christianity and the church in that American Christians are becoming more and more individualized, even if they're going to church. The church means less and less to them. It's less a source of authority. They're primarily gaining most of their information online. They're picking and choosing whom they're listening to. And so what their pastor says, what their church says, what their denomination says is more and more marginal to American Christians.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that has a big impact on social issues, of course, moral social issues, which we're already seeing. We're already in that current of kind of a breakaway from traditional values, for lack of a better term. Well, let me do this. So you have a background in defense. I didn't know this. I went to your Wikipedia page. I don't know if that's true or not because I don't know if I can believe Wikipedia, but it said you're CIA. Can you talk about what did you do and how'd you get there?
That was my first full-time job. I started part-time while still a student at Georgetown University and then stayed there for another 7 years full-time. So that was the end of the Cold War and the first years after the Cold War. So a very different era. I had thought that would be my career, but I hadn't anticipated that the Cold War would end and there would be nothing to do because the world was largely at peace. So at the same time, starting after college graduation, I became very active in the politics of the United Methodist Church, distressed about its liberal theology and its political activism. So just in my own time, I became a United Methodist activist, started my own organization to advocate for denominational reform, and then finally that part-time work, voluntary work, became a full-time job when the Institute on Religion and Democracy asked me in 1994 to work for them full-time and to run their United Methodist project.
You are cranking out a lot of content. I mean, you're writing what, an op-ed every twice a week or something?
That's my goal, not always attained.
That's good. That's good. That's a lot of work. And these are your op-eds are not, 2, 3, 4. They're not tweets, right? They're pretty, pretty involved here. So let me stay on the military a second because I find this interesting. And this kind of segue into the other piece, but I was looking at the numbers, right? So we spend 40% of all global military, more than all the next 19 countries combined, the entire EU, China, Russia, et cetera, et cetera. And it's about almost 20% of our federal budget is military, and we are involved if Chat GPT is to be believed. 178 countries. There are only 195 countries in the world. Is that too much money, or are we in too many places?
Well, it depends on your perspective and the context. The U.S. spent half or more of the federal budget on military spending until the Nixon administration. And through the end of the Cold War, we were spending 5% of our gross national product on the military. Now it's down to about 3%. And as you mentioned, only about 20% of the federal budget. So it's much less than it used to be. But yet, the peace dividend that we gained after the Cold War is now spent. And we're in a very different context.
You should have stayed at the CIA because there's more work to be done, Mark.
Yes, I could go. I don't think they'd want me at this point. But now we have two major strategic adversaries, China being the chief one, and one that, unlike the old Soviet Union, is not just a military adversary, but also an economic adversary. And so we can't afford to reduce our military spending. And that was of interest to IRD in that there was a growing ascendancy of Christian pacifism, at least among the intellectual leadership class of Christian elites, Protestant and evangelicals, much of it a form of absolutist pacifism that defined Christianity by its commitment to total nonviolence, which we found troubling and obviously at odds with historic Christian teaching. And so we founded Providence, the Journal of Christianity, American Foreign Policy, to push back on that starting 10 years ago. The good news is we have largely declared victory in that we can't claim all the credit. But Christian pacifism is much less popular than it was, and it is receding in influence. And as a student at a traditionally pacifist Christian college told me several years ago, we of our age feel like we can't afford to be pacifist. So, but yet, Christians still need guidance and ways to think about national security and when God ordains the state to provide for the common welfare and the defense of society, what does that mean?
Right. Yeah. You don't hear Christian pacifism anymore, but I think that there is a movement, and it speaks to the Israel piece, right? And so we'll go here, of foreign aid, right? And a lot of the foreign aid we give to Israel is in it's in the it's in the form of military aid, military equipment, defense systems, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the arguments, and I want to get to some of your definitions here of anti-Semitism, of Christian Zionism, these kinds of things. For those who believe we should not do any foreign aid, kind of the George Washingtonian, farewell address, be friends with everybody, be involved with none, so trade with people, but don't necessarily get involved with their internal workings. And as I mentioned, we've got 750 military bases in 80 countries, and we're in 91% of the world. The U.S. military is in 91% of the world, countries, that is. And at some point, it seems to me that's a bit it's empire, right? It's one of the things the Great British did for a long time. They were everywhere around the globe, and it's very expensive to do that. And to your point, maybe it's only 3% of the total outlay. But there is a posture that if you do have military on the ground and advisors, et cetera, um, and the Chinese are in 4 countries and the Russians are in 6. That's a real big disparity. I mean, I feel like we've got we have the upper hand here. I'm not saying we shouldn't, but when you look at a comparison, and I know the Chinese are nefarious. They're taking our technology. They do terrible trade deals. Um, but yet we do the trade deals. We brought them into the most favored nation trading status. It was the Clinton presidency and the Gingrich Congress that welcomed them into the table of nations. And we didn't treat the old Soviet Union that way. I mean, for 70 years under the Cold War, we didn't trade with the Soviet Union, right? Because they were our enemies. But today we do it, and we have a trade deficit with with the Chinese. And there's a lot to cover here, but to me, just a cursory glance, we are much more involved. And when you have boots on the ground in that many countries, much military on the ground, guns, it seems to me that you can have a greater chance that we're going to be involved in conflict overseas. And the Chinese and the Russians, well, Russians are certainly in their war right now, and the Chinese have some territorial things with Taiwan. I get all that, but they're not around the globe. And I feel like that posture is a difficult I mean, what do you think? Is that should that be the case? Should we just continue to be in 178 countries and do that?
United States is it's not an empire in the sense the British had an empire. We're not running these countries, but we are a global power with global interest and the leader of the democratic nations and the leader of the Western nations. And for those countries that don't want to align or live under the shadow of Russia or China, we're their only alternative, and responsibilities flow from that. So only spending about 3% of our national wealth to sustain this international alliance seems like a good deal, and the alternatives seem very sinister. I don't think the American wants to live in a world dominated by China or by Russia. So American quote unquote empire is the best offer on the table.
Okay, I'm not gonna dig there. I'm not gonna probe, but I'm gonna go to I wanna get to, uh, define for people what Christian Zionism is. What does that what does that mean exactly?
Most Americans today, if you ask them what that means, they would likely conflate it with Christian dispensationalism, which is a school of thought mostly traceable to an English preacher theologian in the early mid 19th century named Darby. And it's a school of thought mostly associated in the popular imagination with various end time scenarios and the rapture and the left behind literature. And in that narrative, Israel, the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, plays a key role in the end times calendar. So that's what most Americans probably think of when they hear the words Christian Zionism. But Christian Zionism is much older. It's always been around. It just means Christians who believe there is a intrinsic tie between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. So you can reject dispensationalism and still be a Christian Zionist. You can be a Protestant or an evangelical or a Catholic being Christian Zionist. You could be a theological liberal or a theological conservative and be a Christian Zionist. Or you can be, well, you can't be an atheist. Christian Zionist, by definition, is a Christian, but obviously there are atheist Zionists.
So there's a chapter that the Jewish Saint Paul wrote in the book of Romans regarding the Jews being grafted back in. And there's a lot of questions about what that means before the end times, right? There's that passage talks about this issue. And a lot of Christians, you're right, they grab that and they look at the book of Revelation and then they kind of tie the book of Daniel to that. You just have lots of different theories on that, and that's fine. I feel like, I mean, maybe you agree with this, that whether you call it Zionism or not, but I think most Christians believe there's a place for the Jews, the Jewish people in Israel, in this Christian meta narrative of whatever happens at the end times. If you're a preterist, pre-mill, free will, post-mill, whatever, there's a spot for the Jewish people being kind of grafted back in, or something to the end times. Would you agree with that?
Most evangelicals believe so, even if they're not dispensationalist. Often they will cite the promise to Abraham about those who treat the seed of Abraham well, they will be blessed as well. My sense is all of those perspectives are in decline in American Christianity, and younger evangelicals are less inclined to subscribe to those perspectives. They might still be friendly to Israel for other purposes, but less so for theological reasons. But traditionally, American evangelicals have had theological or spiritual reasons for being favorable to Israel or the idea of Israel.
I remember, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the PCUSA, Presbyterian Church United States of America, had multiple statements that were anti-Israel years ago. And I'd say if they wanted, well, let me say not anti-Israel necessarily, but they want to divest from Israel. They want to protect the people of Gaza, the Palestinians, all this kind of thing. And it sort of became a social, in my opinion, kind of um, it was political policy paper kind of stuff. I don't know what why the why they would go down this road. And I don't know if that's just true to like the PCUSA, or was it other moderate churches, or mainline churches. But are you aware of that at all? Does that ring a bell with you?
The liberal led mainline Protestant denominations were pretty pro Israel from the time of its founding up until the 1970s. And what shifted them in part was the influence of, and what led to the foundation of my organization was liberation theology, which sees the world through the prism of the oppressed versus the oppressor, and the church must stand with the oppressed. So it's you're pitting the global South against the wealthy West or North. And so in that liberation theology paradigm, Israel was part of the West or the wealthy North, and the Palestinians or the other Arab states were somehow part of the oppressed. So that played a big role in shifting the mainline Protestant leadership against Israel, and very critical of Israel for the last 50 years, such that we did a study about 15 years ago of all of the mainline Protestant statements on human rights abuses around the world. And the study found that about 90% of them focused on Israel or the United States, having almost nothing to say about China, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that was remarkable and shows at the very least, unhealthy preoccupation with Israel.
Are they are would I mean, does that fall into the category of being anti-Semitic? What do you think? What's your thought?
For the mainline Protestant leadership, that's debatable. They would insist that they're not. But again, if you're obsessed with criticizing Israel, there's reason for some suspicion.
Right, right. And that's kind of what you talked about in one of your two columns I've got in front of me, which is this obsession, right, with Jews and Israel, and et cetera, et cetera. And I think there's a, just I think there's a healthy conversation you can have about this. But I'll say that there seems to be a little bit of a chilling effect happening. You're seeing it online. If you mention Israel, you're put into the anti-Semitic branch. You're kind of put in that bucket. Um, I personally think about Israel as much as I think about South Bend, Indiana, which is not very much, right? I don't live in South Bend. I don't think about it. But if I look at the overall budget of the United States of America, and I think about our deficit, and maybe what our military may be doing overseas, it's um, not in our best interests. I would say, maybe we should not have foreign aid anywhere, including Israel. Let's cut it out, and let's have that conversation. And I feel that some people that want to have that conversation can't have that conversation. Or if you call out APAC, there's the people out there, and I don't know much about it, but there's folks out there calling for um, those members of Congress who take um, Israeli money, quote unquote, to lobby the United States Congress. And I don't mind Israel lobbying the United States Congress, or the president. That's what every country does, and that's in their God-given right to do it. It's fine with me. But it is one of those things that you look at it and think, well, okay, should we bomb Iran because Netanyahu said we should bomb Iran? He's been saying for years, dozens of years, that they're going to build a weapon of mass destruction, et cetera, et cetera. And to be skeptical about that, be skeptical about Netanyahu or any other leader for that matter who says things. Um, I think I just feel like there's a chilling effect out there that if you go down that road, you will pay a dear, dear price. And we've seen this in the past. I mean, Bill Buckley did this with multiple people in the conservative movement who dared bring that up. What say you? What do you think?
We say there's a chilling effect, but there's also an opening of doors and windows that's inviting people to say things about Israel and Jewish people that would have been quite extraordinary just a few years ago. So the popularity of Nick Fuentes would have been almost unheard of 10 years ago. And the fact that a major figure like Tucker Carlson has a friendly attitude towards Nick Fuentes would have been quite remarkable 10 years ago. And I keep hearing lots and lots of young men are listening to Nick Fuentes. So I've been doing my own informal survey. Everyone I talk to is a young man or works among them. I'm asking, oh, are you listening to Nick Fuentes? And the answers I'm getting back is primarily, yes, they are listening to Fuentes, but they're not taking him very seriously. They think he's an entertainer, which okay, but poison is poison is poison, and even if you don't treat it seriously, poison still has an impact. So we should be alarmed and concerned, and should respond to the influence of someone like Nick Fuentes and those who are defending him, especially if they're claiming, as Fuentes does, to be Christians and proclaiming Christ is king, while also tweeting, as Fuentes does, I'm on Team Hitler.
Yeah, I mean, look, I agree with that, but I also agree in his right to speak. I mean, there's that, that famous phrase, I will, I may disagree with what you say, but I'll fight for your right to say it. And I feel like the best posture on these things is to let them play out. Let idiots be idiots. I mean, we're a free country. You can be an idiot in America if you want to be. And I've listened to him, I think, twice, and I found him. My takeaway is what you said. He's an entertainer, um, but as a Christian, and he claims to be a Christian, I would say things like, just on a baseline, why do you curse? Why is every third word a curse word? I mean, really? I mean, to me, there's some things that just are abrasive to me that go contrary to St. Paul's teachings, for example. But having said that, I just feel like the reaction to stifling and or jettisoning people from the movement because they're allowing free speech, that may be more dangerous than the free speech itself. That's what do you think? Is that not should we jettison people from the movement?
To my knowledge, no one prominent has said Fuentes doesn't have a right of free speech. And I often recall that growing up in Arlington, Virginia, the American Nazi Party was headquartered there and marched in our Fourth of July parade. They met in public schools. They had a prominent role. Fortunately, they were few in number, but no one questioned their right to do so. But they were thoroughly denounced and fortunately never gained in popularity. And in the 1980s, finally went away. So Fuentes can say whatever he wants. And I'm glad we have a First Amendment. But I hope decent people, and especially Christians, will renounce him and not platform him.
Yeah, and well, there are not many heads yet. Heads haven't rolled yet, but there are calls for heads to roll. And just this morning, we talked about Robert P. George, who I think is at Princeton, who was on the board of Heritage Foundation, stepped down because of Kevin Roberts' remarks um, regarding that whole Nick Fuentes Tucker Carlson interview a month or so ago. There are people who are putting pressure on Roberts to be fired because he stood up for the free speech rights of Tucker to interview. And then even Trump said something, yeah, I think it was yesterday or the day before about the Fuentes interview that, hey, that's fine. He could talk, whatever. And Trump actually met with the guy down in Mar-a-Lago. And so there is, people who are asking policymakers to explain their actions, and if they're not done well enough, that they need to step down. Possibly, there are people who are calling on people to step down if you have any association with the individual in this case. I mean, it seems to be playing out that way a little bit. No.
Well, I think that's largely positive that mainstream people who are involved in the governance of our country are not platforming someone who is pro-Hitler. We want to keep those people marginal and not in the mainstream of the left or of the right.
On that, I've got three young guys, and they're 3 years apart, three boys, and they're 3 years apart, and their grandparents don't quite understand kind of some of their positions on things, right? And not that they're Hitler lovers or anything like that, but they have positions that admire people online that they know are sometimes really bad people. But what they like about them is their willingness to say certain things that you can't say as a young Anglo person living in America. They do. They want to be strong, so they want to bulk up. And not all my guys are doing that, but there's a generational thing where they feel like they've been stepped on for dozens of years. Colleges now 60% are women, 40% are guys. There's so my point is that there's almost a crying out. Young men want to see tough guys be guys almost. I mean, there's been the sexual revolution of, sex change stuff of identifying this way or that way. And if you don't call him a her or vice versa, you'll be suspended from school. There's a real resistance there. And I think Nick's tapping into that some. I think there's certainly part of that. Andrew Tate's part of that thing too. While these are, I don't think, decent people that I would be friends with, they're reaching a generation of guys who seem to be really. I guess the word is they're in angst or something. There's a pushback at the establishment. Was that your sense at all?
Well, yes, it is, and the danger is that young men begin to equate manhood and strength with political extremism, with cruelty, with degradation. Was the appeal of radical Islam in Iran in 1979, or Nazism in the 20s, or even Bolshevism before that. This is a macho movement for real men who don't have any space or time for nonsense. So get out of the way. So obviously, it's incumbent upon more responsible men to model a form of manhood that is temperate and responsible. And if you're Christian, hopefully lives by the teachings of Christ.
Right, right. I agree. That's yeah, no doubt. So define for folks anti-Semitism. What does that exactly mean? And where did the word Semitism come from? I mean, it's a term. It's derogatory to the Jewish people. Or not derogatory. It just defines a group of people who don't like Jews and Israel. Is that right? Is that what it means?
Anti Semitism, I would define as a prejudice against the Jewish people because they're Jewish. And I suppose it's like under other racial or tribal prejudices, but it's more universal and pervasive. And it seems to especially be popular or connected with conspiracy theories and is often propagated by authoritarian and totalitarian movements and regimes. Obviously, the Nazis, obviously, the fascists, but the Soviet Union, the communists certainly played with anti Semitism. Obviously, Islamist movements are very anti Semitic. And so it's a bizarre preoccupation with the Jewish people and claims about their supposed great power over the world, even though they're very few in number. And so anti Semitism is maybe more dangerous than other hatreds and prejudices in that it usually has political and cultural ramifications that are dangerous for the whole of society.
So yeah. So you hate the Jewish people for being Jewish, and somehow you're right. There's a conspiracy. There's an international conspiracy that run all the banks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I still have a hard time getting my brain around this. Why this is even an issue, right? Secondly, you've got people like Fuentes out there on the right who are saying certain things. But then we have people on the left who are pulling a trigger and killing people. Or here in Virginia, you have the attorney general who said, "I want to kill my Republican opponent and put bullets in him. If I had a one bullet left for Hitler or this guy, I'd kill my Republican opponent. He gets elected." Right? It seems to me that we ought to be more preoccupied with LGBTQ individuals who walk into churches, into elementary Christian schools, and kill lots of people. And I feel like we're not talking about that as much as we are the free speech of this person or the anti-Semitism. Words are one thing. Sticks and stones will but words will never hurt me, right? The other side's using sticks and stones right now, Mark. I mean, what do we do on that front?
Obviously, you have to reject political violence, or any kind of rhetorical acceptance of political violence is unacceptable. And, is it more on the right or on the left? Are there hard statistics? I see it on both sides, both the action and the rhetoric. And we're living in an age of extreme polarization and demonization. And the people we perceive as our adversaries are not just wrong, they're evil. And if you think they're evil, well, and if this is the equivalent of World War II, then, well, I guess you can begin to justify almost everything against your adversaries. So I hope the church and Christianity in America will play a role in de-escalating these attitudes and this rhetoric. And the vast majority of Americans don't have any use for this kind of extremism or flirtation with political violence. So let's just appreciate that where we are, most Americans are still, obviously, as Christians, we know we're all sinners, but most Americans, relative to history and relative to the world, are basically decent people who want to live harmoniously together.
Well, this is going to bring me right back to 1861 because there is talk. There's talk out there in the netherworld of a thing called a civil war or a national divorce. And you wrote a book called The Peace That Almost Was, a forgotten story of the 1861 Washington Peace Conference and the final attempt to avert the Civil War. So you have a little bit of history in this. It's like Rod Dreher when he looked at he talked to Eastern Europeans in his book, Live Not by Lies, and wanted to talk to them, said, hey, is communism coming to the West? A lot of them said, yes, it is, in fact, because we lived through it, we saw it. It's totalitarianism, it's whatever, soft dictatorship, whatever. What do you think about where we are as a country? Right? Where are we? Are we in 1861 all over again? Or are we at that point or not?
We are not in 1861, and we're not on the verge of a physical civil war, but I don't like the talk about civil war because talk can often lead to action. So let's stay away from the talk. But our rhetoric has often acted as though we're in that situation, and that is, of course, very dangerous. So I hope that we can de-escalate the rhetoric and understand, especially as Christians, that social harmony in and of itself is a positive social good. We take it for granted in America, and yet many countries in the world do not have it, and we've been blessed with it, and let's work to sustain it.
People have said that our diversity is our greatest strength. And I heard a gentleman in England speak because they're having a crisis in London right now, multiple places in the EU. He said, our diversity is our greatest challenge. And I thought it was interesting. I thought, well, I sense that's one of the challenges we have here. My grandparents came over through Ellis Island from Eastern Europe, and they wanted to learn English as soon as they possibly could. And they did, and they made a successful life up outside of New York City. And my sense is that that's not necessarily the case for immigrants today or many Americans today. There's almost this, my grandparents had to go through classes and learn about American history. They had to, know about the Constitution. They didn't come here for a free Obama phone or whatever, right? I mean, that's kind of the talk. Is that an issue? Could we tighten up, what it means to be an American citizen?
My anecdotal and personal impressions are that immigrants overwhelmingly want to be Americans and are prone to patriotism, and that the rhetoric that questions America's exceptionality usually comes from Americans, people whose families have been here for many generations, who've gone to Ivy League schools and have bought into ideologies that demonize America. So I don't see that so much coming from immigrants, but from old timers, maybe descendants of the Puritans up at Harvard, who have these anti-American attitudes. But you do have to explain the rationale for patriotism repeatedly for every generation in every country. But America is a very special country with a very unique history with a very special creed, and that has to be constantly re-explained because we have challenges to that creed now, both left and from the right.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, it's I sense so, and I'll leave it here as we've gone almost to we're almost time. But let me ask you this, Mark. I mean, you've been in the policy world for a lot of years. You're writing every week. What are the greatest challenges facing our country right now? I mean, just if you had to say, hey, this is the greatest challenge I see our country has right now.
There are many. The one that comes immediately to mind is the retreat, not the collapse, but the retreat of civil society and community and the hyper individualization that comes from being online. So, no more gatekeepers. I create my own reality through what I follow online and what I say online. And a central part of that retreat of civil society is the retreat of the institutional church. And Christianity is thriving in many ways, but the institutional church is not thriving so much in America. So, how can we reverse that and reinvigorate the institutional church, not just Christian faith, but commitment to the church as an institution? That's a big question. Trying to strengthen and perpetuate those denominations that still exist, like the Anglican Church and the New Methodist Church and others, is a part of that, but there needs to be a bigger picture.
All right, final question, for well, maybe 2 questions to take that back. I'll ask 2 more. You're a young person, you wanna make a difference in America, you wanna you're a patriot or whatever, and you love this country. What advice do you give young people today?
Commit yourselves to America's intrinsic principles and be patient. Do not expect some level of perfection. Uh, count your blessing. That's a cliche, but it's a true cliche because you're among the most privileged people who have ever walked the face of the earth. So, lots of problems. You're not going to be handed everything that you want, but you have more than almost everybody else. So, make the most of it and be grateful for it and build on it.
I like it, and okay, so then here's my I ask everyone this. So, Mark, you're well read, you write a ton. What books would you recommend or someone who is looking at policy, what policy books or well, maybe not policy books, maybe you read Dostoevsky and that made a difference. What books would you recommend to young people to read, today? Say 3. 3 of the books that have influenced you the most.
The book that influenced me as a college student and which played a role in the founding of my organization was by the Catholic thinker Michael Novak called The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism that he wrote in 1902, explaining theologically and philosophically why democracy and capitalism are the best forms for the prosperity and liberty of any society. It was kind of provocative arguments in the early 1980s. And again, they're provocative today and need to be reflected upon today. More recently, several years ago, the English historian wrote the book Dominion, how Christianity transformed the world in ways.
Tom Holland.
Tom Holland. And it's a wonderful overview of how Christianity lifted up human dignity, such that all of these assumptions that almost everyone has today about human rights, even if they're secular, oh, well, people have rights. Well, why do people have rights? Well, that pretty much comes from Christianity. And for those who are very gloomy, the fact that these Christian inspired assumptions are so universal, we can celebrate as a great victory and build on that. Oh, the third book, I'll name an obscure book that no one has read unless you're very eccentric. But there's an English historian named Herbert Butterfield, best known for his book he wrote, his first book in the 1930s, The Whig Interpretation of History. A lot of people have heard of that, but he wrote a book I like a lot better in World War II called The Englishman and His History, which is a celebration of the Whig tradition. Well, what does Whig mean? It's the Anglo-American tradition of classical liberty, and he notes that and it's gradual. It evolved slowly across the centuries. He said no one ever sat down and said, "Oh, I'm going to create a system for religious freedom and toleration." It happened through struggle and combat, kind of an unexpected surprise, and yet there it is. So it's a providential view of history.
That's neat. I'm almost done with Holland's book, and that's your point. absolutely a mega bomb of free. And for those of us who are believers, it's wow. I mean, and I'm not sure where Tom is. I think he's attending a Church of England church. I'm not even sure, if he's actually full on Christian or not. But uh, just an incredible book. And I'm right with you. I would totally read that, and I'll look at these other two as you've mentioned. But thank you, Mark, for your views. And where can people find Mark Tooley and the Institute for Religion and Democracy?
You can go to theird.org, theird.org.
Great. And you're on Twitter and all that stuff, right?
Yes, Twitter.
Great. Mark, thank you for coming. I enjoy it. We'll get you all the pieces of this in a few weeks when we get it all together. Your team can use it, put it out there or not, whatever. All right.
Thank you, Pat. All right, bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Against the Current podcast requires more than a conversation. It takes action, research, and collective wisdom. If today's episode resonated with you, we'd love to hear your insights. Join the conversation and help us shape the future together. We'll be back with more stories, strategies, and real-world solutions that are making a difference for everyone. In the meantime, be sure to subscribe, rate, write a review, and share it with someone you think would benefit from it too. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.